Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, and with me is Sam. Today we're asking about canceling plans. Why a simple, I can't make it, can somehow turn into this weird little performance, and why people hear that as guilt-trippy instead of just honest.
Yeah, because refusals are face-threatening, so people load them up with regret and excuses to soften the blow. But that script can still feel like you're managing my feelings instead of just telling me the truth.
Right, and that's the friction here. A lot of the drama is just face work, but the question is when that turns into social pressure. Let's start with the starting take, because that's the complaint worth testing first. Sam, start us off.
Okay, here's the thing that keeps bugging me. When somebody cancels plans and says they're disappointed, it can sound less like honesty and more like a little guilt trip. Like, no, you're not devastated. You're staying home and probably enjoying the relief. Just say you can't make it.
That's the annoying part, yes. But I think we should separate two things right away. People softening bad news and people using softness to make the other person feel bad for having a reaction. Those are not the same thing, even if they can sound similar.
Right, and I'm not saying every cancellation is some huge moral event. I'm saying there's a version of it where the person is clearly relieved, maybe even thrilled, but they still have to dress it up like they're mourning the loss of dinner. That is what feels fake.
And the next question is, why that same sentence lands fine in one situation and gross in another? Because sometimes it's just a polite cushion, and sometimes it's the speaker trying to make the cancellation feel like a shared emotional burden instead of a simple change of plans.
Exactly. If you cancel and say, I'm really disappointed, I'm supposed to what? Reassure you? Apologize for existing? It can feel like the whole point is to make the other person take care of your feelings after you already pulled the plug. That's the part that gets under my skin.
Sometimes, though, that sentence is just a social cushion. People don't always mean, please punish yourself on my behalf. Sometimes they mean, I know this is annoying, and I'm trying not to sound casual about it. Tone matters a lot there, and relationship matters too. If somebody is usually reliable, that line reads differently than if they're always drifting in late with some soft apology.
Sure, but why does it so often land like a pressure move? That's the part I want to pin down. If it's just cushioning, why does it start feeling like the other person is being asked to absorb the inconvenience and the emotion around?
Because sometimes that's exactly what happens. The cancellation is one thing, but the follow-up becomes, please also reassure me that I'm not a bad person for canceling. And if that happens every time, the apology stops being about respect and starts becoming a way to manage the other person's reaction.
Yeah, that's the part that feels socially annoying. Not the fact of changing plans. Everybody does that sometimes. But the little extra demand hidden in the tone. It's like the message isn't just, I can't come. It's, and I'd like credit for feeling bad about it.
That's the useful distinction. Feeling bad is normal. Making the other person carry your guilt is where it gets weird. If you really want a clean version, it can be something as plain as, I can't make it, and I know that's a pain. No performance, no self-punishment theater. Just basic respect.
Okay, but where would you draw the line, Joe? Because I can already hear someone saying, well, I do feel bad, and that seems fair enough. Is the problem the phrase itself, or the moment it starts asking for reassurance from the person who got canceled on?
It's mostly the second thing. If the feeling is real and the wording is just a little soft, fine. If the canceller is trying to make their discomfort the main event, then the politeness starts to feel like a tax on the other person. That's when it stops being a cushion and starts being a signal.
Okay, but before we get too polished about it, my first reaction is just, somebody cancels and says they're disappointed, and I instantly feel like I have to perform being sad back.
That's the orientation point, though. The weirdness isn't the cancellation itself. It's that little second where you realize there's now a correct face you're supposed to put on.
Exactly. And it can be totally harmless and still feel like a social tax. Like, fine, nobody's evil, but now I'm managing your feelings about my Tuesday night.
And that tax is weirdly mutual. The person canceling may genuinely feel bad, or they may mostly feel relieved and be trying not to sound like a jerk. Either way, everybody is editing themselves a little.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the phrase can still sound guilt-trippy even when the person means it sincerely?
I don't think so. Sincere doesn't erase the pressure, because the sentence still asks the other person to absorb disappointment on your behalf. That's not a crime, but it is a request.
Right, and that's the part people dodge. They hear disappointed and pretend it's just politeness. But it can also be a tiny way of saying, please don't make me feel like the bad guy.
That's the awkward bit.
It tells the other person, help me carry this social mess. Even if nobody says that out loud.
Yes, but I wouldn't make that sound sinister. A lot of people are just trying not to sound weirdly cheerful about bailing. There is a middle ground between honesty and being a jerk, and this is usually where people are trying to stand.
And honestly, sometimes the canceled person is relieved too, which makes the whole script even funnier. Now, both people know the plan was kind of a pain, and we're all still doing the little etiquette dance anyway.
That's why it feels sticky. The social situation is already solved in private, but the public version still wants a polite sentence so nobody has to say, yeah, this was probably going to be annoying for both of us.
That's basically the thing I can't unsee. People are often trying to preserve goodwill, but the wording can still make the whole cancellation feel heavier than it needs to be.
Because it borrows the language of sadness. If you say you're disappointed, the other person hears more than, I wish things were different. They hear a hint that they owe you something emotionally.
So the issue isn't that people should announce, great, I was hoping you'd cancel. It's that the fake sadness can feel like a little performance everyone is trapped in, even when everybody knows the truth.
Exactly. And I think that's why the phrase deserves closer inspection. It often means something decent, but it also opens the door to a weird kind of pressure if people use it automatically.
Yeah, so we're not saying the phrase is evil. We're saying it's common enough and awkward enough that people probably know there is more going on in it than they admit.
That sounds right. It starts as courtesy, but it can drift into a script that makes everyone slightly more honest in private than they are out loud. And that's the part worth poking at next.
Okay, so the real issue isn't just that the plans got canceled. It's that the standard script sometimes sounds like, I'm sorry, I'm disappointed too. And then you're supposed to carry the emotional cleanup for them. That's the part that feels off. It stops being a scheduling problem and starts feeling like you're being recruited into their guilt, which is a weird little job to hand somebody who just got canceled on.
That's the cleaner version of the suspicion. People aren't only reacting to the cancellation itself, they're reacting to the extra job attached to it. If someone says, sorry, I'm disappointed, the question is whether that's just ordinary courtesy or whether it's doing a little emotional leverage work. And those are not the same thing, even if they can sound almost identical in the moment.
Right, because disappointment is a real feeling. Nobody's arguing people have to sound thrilled when they cancel. The weird part is when it feels scripted, like a little moral performance. Not I can't make it, but I'm so disappointed. Said in this careful voice that says, please notice I'm still a good person. That tone can be doing a lot more than the sentence is admitting.
And that's where tone matters as much as the words. A clean cancellation can sound like, I can't do tonight, sorry, let's find another time. That's annoying, but it's straightforward. The draggy version is where the person keeps explaining, padding, and apologizing until the whole exchange starts feeling like you're supposed to reassure them instead of just receiving the cancellation. That extra wobble is what people remember.
Exactly. The suspicion is not, you should never feel bad. It's more like, are you telling me this because it's true or because it buys you moral cover? Because once you hear that pattern enough, the phrase stops sounding like honesty and starts sounding like insulation. It protects the canceller from looking inconsiderate, but it can leave the other person holding the awkward feeling and pretending that's normal.
That's the fair criticism. People often don't want the plain social fact, which is canceling is sometimes necessary and still mildly disappointing. You do not need a dramatic confession every time. If the apology is too heavy, it can actually make the other person work harder, because now they're managing your discomfort about their inconvenience. The cancellation ends up with a lot more emotional furniture than it needed.
So the suspicion isn't really about honesty in the abstract. It's about pressure. The canceller says they're disappointed, and suddenly the conversation shifts from, fine, life happens, to, oh no, now I have to reassure you that you're not a bad friend or a terrible human being. That's what makes it feel rude, even when the words are technically polite. The burden got moved, quietly, and that's what people notice.
Yes, and I think that's why some people get touchy about over-explaining too. A short, direct cancellation lets the other person orient quickly. A long, emotional one can feel like you're being invited into the canceller's whole internal weather report, and nobody asked for that. More importantly, the longer it goes, the more likely it is that the other person feels like they have to answer gently or the mood gets punished.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the real offense is that the canceller wants credit for being decent while still making you absorb the inconvenience? Because that's the vibe that gets people annoyed. It feels less like sorry and more like, please file my regret appropriately and be nice about it.
That's close, but I'd tighten it. It's not always credit seeking in some grand way. Sometimes it's just someone trying to manage guilt badly. Still, the impact can be the same. The other person ends up doing emotional labor to soothe a cancellation that should have stayed fairly small. So I don't think the suspicion has to be, this person is fake. It can just be, this person made their discomfort my problem.
Yeah, and that's why people get suspicious without necessarily thinking the other person is evil. They're not saying every apology is manipulation. They're saying this one came bundled with a little pressure, and pressure changes the feel of it. If you cancel and then act wounded about it, the other person is suddenly performing sympathy for you instead of just accepting the change. That's where the irritation comes from.
And the other part is that the clean version is not hard. You can be honest without making it a whole emotional event. I'm sorry, I can't make it is enough most of the time. If you want to add anything, it should probably make the exchange easier, not heavier. The minute your explanation starts sounding like a request for comfort, you can feel the temperature change.
Right, so the useful distinction is intent versus effect. Someone can mean, I feel bad, and still land on, please make this easier for me. That's why people get suspicious without necessarily thinking the other person is evil. It feels like the cancellation came with a tiny hidden bill, and the other person is expected to pay it with kindness.
That's the line we probably need before we start judging motives. Not every apology is manipulation, but some apologies are too loaded to count as just information. So the next question is, what a clean, honest cancellation sounds like when it doesn't dump the guilt onto the other person, and where that line actually sits when people are trying to be decent but not dramatic. Okay, before we keep arguing about the vibe of all this, I think we need to pin down the basic language people are actually using. Half the fight is people using the same words for three different things and then acting shocked when nobody agrees.
Yeah, because one person says, I canceled, and another person means, I may or may not show up. Please keep your Saturday open while I drift around in the fog. Those are not the same social act. One is a clean no. The other is a hostage note written in calendar ink.
That's the cleanest split. Canceling means you're not going. Rescheduling means you're not going now, but you're proposing another time. And soft committing is the annoying middle zone where you're not quite in, not quite out, and everyone else is doing calendar gymnastics around your maybe.
That middle zone is where people get mad because it is not just life happened. It is, I did not want to say no cleanly. So I made my uncertainty your problem. And people can feel that even when they can't explain it neatly.
Yes, and that's the useful distinction. The rude part is often not the cancellation itself. It's the vague waiting. If you know you're out, say you're out. If you need to check one thing first, say that. People can handle reality a lot better than a floating promise.
But here's where people get slippery. They say, I had to cancel, when really they mean, I never fully committed, and now I'm trying to back out without sounding flaky. Those are different, and everybody knows they're different. The first one is bad luck. The second one is trying to rewrite the history of the invitation.
Sure, but I would separate intent from effect. Someone can genuinely feel bad and still create the same annoyance as a flake. The listener doesn't experience the little private tragedy in your head. They experience the schedule change. So the social question is not just, did you mean well? It is, did you leave the other person holding the bag?
So when someone says, I'm really disappointed, that can mean at least three things. 1, I am genuinely sad I can't go. 2, please don't be mad at me. 3, I want you to tell me I'm still good and this doesn't change anything.
Exactly. And those aren't interchangeable, which is why people misread each other so fast. The first is emotion. The second is repair. The third is reassurance seeking, which is normal enough, but it can sound manipulative if you make the other person carry your feelings for you.
So what's the sharper version of the complaint then? Is it that people shouldn't cancel, or that they shouldn't make you babysit their feelings while they cancel? Because those are not the same thing, and one of them is a lot fairer than the other.
It's the second one. Most people are not furious because a plan changed. They're irritated because the cancellation comes wrapped in a soft demand for comfort, like the other person is supposed to say, no, you're wonderful. Please don't feel bad. That turns a simple no into an emotional job.
And that's where it starts feeling rude, even when the words are polite. The phrase can be sincere and still land like pressure. I'm so sorry, I'm really disappointed, can be honest regret from one person and a tiny guilt tax from another. Same sentence, different social weight.
Right, because the words are doing different jobs at once. Sometimes they're a real apology, sometimes they're social grease, and sometimes they're a way to soften a no. None of that is automatically evil. But if your apology makes the other person feel like they have to comfort you for having a normal reaction, that is where it starts to wobble.
And texting makes it worse because the same sentence can look either sincere or performative depending on the relationship. A friend who rarely cancels can say it and sound genuinely bummed out. Somebody who always leaves things fuzzy can say the exact same words and it reads like they are trying to launder a no into a nice sound.
That's why the context matters more than the script. If you already said yes, then back out late. The regret reads differently than if you were never really available and just kept the door cracked open. Same phrase, different moral shape. The sentence is not the whole story. The timing and the pattern do a lot of the work.
So the boring definition is basically this. Canceling is withdrawing. Rescheduling is replacing. Soft committing is hovering. And regret can be either genuine or a social shield. Which means the real question is not, did they say sorry? It is, did they actually take the burden off the other person, or did they leave them holding it? Okay, so the boring definition is on the table, which means we can finally get to the two bad answers people reach for. One is, just be brutally honest and stop acting like a hostage negotiator. The other is, if you're bothered by a cancellation, you're just too sensitive. Both sound clean, both are kind of garbage.
That's the right place to start poking, because those answers are attractive for opposite reasons. The blunt one feels morally pure. The dismissive one feels efficient. Neither one has to deal with what people are actually doing when they cancel plans, which is managing obligation without making the whole thing feel ugly.
Right. And the bluntness fantasy is always so smug. It imagines somebody saying, "Sorry, I don't feel like coming." And then everybody just nods like a healthy little bird colony. No awkwardness, no follow-up text, no silence later, no one privately wondering if they got blown off. Just pure truth, cleanly absorbed by the social system.
And that fantasy skips the part where the message lands inside a real relationship. Sometimes blunt honesty is fine. Sometimes it reads as, "I want out, and I also want to make sure you know I didn't try very hard." The words may be true. The effect can still be rude.
But isn't that exactly why people get mad? Because they want the polite version to carry the weight for them? Like, don't tell me you're disappointed if you're obviously relieved. Just say, "I can't make it," and keep it moving. Why is that controversial?
Because "I can't make it" is not always the whole transaction. A lot of people are also saying, "I know this is a nuisance, and I'm trying not to make it feel like I'm casually blowing you off." That's the social smoothing part. It can be fake if it's overdone, but it isn't fake by definition.
So your point is that the nicer language is sometimes doing real work, not just costume jewelry for liars.
Exactly. It's not always deception. Sometimes it's a way of saying, "I still value you, even though I'm bailing." The problem is when the wording gets so polished that it starts to sound like the person wants credit for the cancellation itself. Then it feels like guilt with better manners.
Yeah, that's the part people react to, not the cancellation. The little performance of sorrow where somebody says they're disappointed, and you can hear the insulation in it. It feels like they want to sound considerate while still getting the night back without any friction.
But we should be careful not to turn every awkward apology into manipulation. Some people really are disappointed and still need to cancel. They don't want the plans. They do want to be seen as respectful. Those two things can exist at once, which is irritating because it ruins the clean moral story.
So am I overstating it if I say the real irritation is when the apology asks the other person to carry the disappointment for both people? Like, "I'm sorry" turns into, "Please reassure me that I'm still good." And now the canceled person has to do extra emotional work just to absorb the change.
That's the cleaner version of it, yeah. The issue isn't just the sentence, it's the burden the sentence creates. If someone cancels once and speaks plainly, most people can handle it. If they repeatedly cancel, always soften it, and then act like the other person is rude for noticing, that's where the pattern starts to matter.
Okay, so let's split the clean version from the annoying version. If somebody cancels plans and says they're disappointed, one reasonable read is just they're trying not to sound like they don't care. That's basic social grease. You don't have to announce, I was secretly thrilled this fell apart, every time your Friday night gets freed up. That would be honest, but also kind of rude in a very efficient way.
That's the charitable read, and I think it's real. If you're close to someone, you usually do want them to know the cancellation isn't casual. And disappointment is a pretty normal way to say, I did want to see you. It can be simple courtesy rather than theater.
Right. It can mean, this mattered to me too, and it keeps the whole thing from turning into a cold little transaction. If you care about the relationship, you often want to soften the edges a bit, instead of making every canceled plan sound like a verdict on the other person. Nobody wants to feel like a scheduling error with legs.
It can, but sometimes it also sounds like, please don't let me be the only one carrying the disappointment.
Yeah, and that's the other reasonable reading. The phrase can turn into a little social shield. Not a lie exactly, but a way of making the cancellation feel less one-sided. Especially with people who are sensitive, or relationships where you know one person always worries they're being blown off. Saying you're disappointed can be the difference between all good and why do I always feel like I'm bothering you?
So the issue is less the words themselves and more how much they're doing. If you say it once, it sounds human. If you say it every time and it always lands with this tiny little moral weight, then people start hearing obligation hidden inside politeness. Sam, do you think the problem is the phrase or the habit of using it as a pressure release valve?
It's the habit. I don't think the phrase is inherently manipulative. A lot of people are just trying to preserve the social fabric in real time, and they don't want their friend or partner to sit there feeling stupid, rejected, or like they made you rearrange your life for nothing. But I also think we all know when disappointed is doing more than conveying a feeling. Sometimes it's doing a job. It's covering up relief or annoyance, or the plain fact that nobody really wanted to go that much, and now everyone is pretending the canceled dinner was emotionally pivotal.
That's the uncomfortable bit. Intent and impact can diverge here without anybody being a monster. You can mean it kindly and still create a weird little guilt cloud around the other person. And if that becomes the default script, the receiver starts feeling like every cancellation needs a performance review.
And that's where closeness matters, because the exact same sentence can land very differently depending on who says it. If it's your best friend or your sister, disappointment can sound like care. If it's somebody who always acts wounded when plans change, it starts to feel like a trap, even if the words are technically polite. So the real question is not just, did they say it? It's, is this a one-off courtesy or part of a pattern where your cancellation always becomes about their feelings?
That's a better test. One sentence isn't enough to convict anybody, but pattern matters. If the person is generally easygoing and says, "Aw, bummer, hope you feel better," nobody's going to file that under emotional blackmail. If they always say they're disappointed in a way that makes you feel like you owe them something, then the phrase stops sounding like kindness and starts sounding like leverage.
So tell me where you draw the line. What would make it fair instead of fake? Because I think there is a version where you can honestly say, I was looking forward to this, and it just reads as warm. You are not trying to guilt anybody. You're just not pretending the plan meant nothing. But if you know you are actually relieved, or you know the other person is already anxious, then the careful move is to skip the performative sighing and just be clear.
Fair is when the words match the actual feeling closely enough that the other person doesn't have to translate them. If you genuinely wanted the plan, say so. If you're relieved, you don't need to add fake grief to prove you have a soul. The problem is when the script tries to protect your image at the expense of the other person's comfort.
Yeah, that is the clean version. Not every cancellation needs a courtroom apology, and not every disappointment is a scam. But once the phrase starts carrying more emotional weight than the situation actually has, people can feel the gap immediately. That's what makes it feel rude or guilt-trippy, even when nobody is trying to be cruel.
Exactly. The phrase is fine when it describes the truth. It gets weird when it starts doing social damage control for feelings that aren't really there. And once you can hear that difference, you stop treating every "I'm disappointed" as either noble or manipulative. It's usually somewhere in between, which is annoying, but also more honest.
Okay, so here's the awkward split. The public answer is, I'm disappointed, but the private truth can be, I'm mostly relieved. And that's not automatically some evil little lie. It just means people are often saying the safer version out loud because the real version sounds rude.
Yeah, and the first distinction worth making is what the relief is actually about. Sometimes you're relieved about the event ending. Sometimes you're relieved about the obligation, the energy it would take, or the fact that you were never that excited in the first place. Those are not the same thing.
Right, because people hear disappointed and assume it means the canceled thing was the real loss. But a lot of the time, the real loss is the pressure to show up, be pleasant, and act like you're thrilled to be there when you're not thrilled at all.
Exactly. If you were genuinely looking forward to going and then something changed, that's one kind of disappointment. If you were already half dreading it and then got a socially acceptable exit, that's another. The same sentence can cover both, which is why people get suspicious of it.
And that's the part nobody likes saying out loud. They don't only regret the plan, they regret being trapped in the plan. So when they cancel, the honest feeling can be relief, and the polite feeling can be guilt. And those two get mashed together until the message sounds prettier than it is.
Sam, am I overstating it if I say some of that politeness is just the default script, not a deliberate guilt tactic? Because I think people hear, "I'm sorry," and assume manipulation, when sometimes it's just the social language we use to keep things smooth.
No, that's fair. I'm not saying every "so sorry" is a scheme. I'm saying the script gets used for two jobs at once. It lowers tension, and it hides the fact that you may be relieved. And once those two jobs collide, the other person can feel the mismatch, even if they can't name it.
Right. And that's why the phrase can feel slippery. The listener hears, "I'm disappointed," and thinks, are you disappointed about the event, or disappointed that you now have to manage the social fallout of saying no? Those are very different things, and the second one is the one that starts to feel fake.
Which is the annoying part, not the cancellation itself. It's the little handoff where your discomfort becomes my job. You cancel, then I have to reassure you that I'm not angry, I'm not offended, and I still think you're a good person. Suddenly, I'm doing emotional cleanup for your decision.
And that's where it starts to feel socially punishing, even if nobody means it that way. The cancellation is one thing. The pressure to absorb the canceler's guilt is another. It changes the interaction from "this plan changed" to "please help me feel better about changing it."
Yes, and to be fair, sometimes people are actually disappointed about the social meaning of the cancellation. They don't want to go, but they do care that they look flaky, or that they let somebody down, or that they made the day awkward. That's real too.
That is the useful distinction. "I hate missing the thing," and "I hate what missing the thing says about me" are separate feelings, even if they show up in the same sentence. If you blur them together, The other person can't tell whether you're being honest or just protecting your image.
And that's why the clean version matters. I can't make it, and I know that's annoying, gives the other person something real. I'm devastated can be true, sure, but it also sounds like you're asking for extra sympathy you may not actually need. It starts to feel less like information and more like a demand.
I think that's the part people react to. Not that someone has mixed feelings. Everyone has mixed feelings. It's when the mixed feelings get packaged in a way that makes the listener responsible for smoothing them out. Then the politeness stops being neutral and starts doing a job it shouldn't have to do.
And the funny part is that most people would probably prefer the simpler truth if it were said plainly. I'm sorry, I was looking forward to it, but not enough to force it, is awkward. But at least it's not pretending to be more wounded than it is. It respects the other person's intelligence.
Yeah, and it gives the other person something workable. They can understand whether the issue is the event, the obligation, the timing, or just the social cost of backing out. That is a lot better than making them guess which version of disappointment they are supposed to react to.
So the rule isn't spill every ugly thought, and it isn't say whatever sounds nicest. It's more like, don't make your apology do double duty if the second job is getting the other person to manage your guilt. That's where the honest version matters more than the polished one.
Exactly. And once you can see that gap, the next question is obvious. If everyone recognizes the polished script, why does it survive so stubbornly anyway? Okay, so once the gap between what somebody says and what they actually feel is obvious, the next question is why the script sticks. The boring answer is that it gives people something useful, even when it feels a little fake.
Useful for who, though? Because from the canceled on side, it can feel like you're being handed a polite, apology-shaped object just so the other person doesn't have to sit in their own awkwardness.
Mostly useful for the person canceling. They get to protect their image, reduce the chance of a fight, and avoid sounding cold. It's face-saving on both sides, at least in theory. You soften the refusal so nobody has to sit in the raw version of, I don't want to do this.
But the raw version is sometimes the honest one.
It can be, sure. But people are allergic to sounding harsh, so they add regret, excuses, and a little emotional padding because that's the socially approved move. Politeness says, don't make this feel sharp. And most people obey that pretty automatically.
So the incentive isn't just being nice, it's avoiding the moment where somebody has to say, okay, so you don't actually want to come. That little moment is where the script gets exposed.
Exactly. That's the part most people are trying to dodge. They want the cancellation to land softly, not turn into a direct conversation about priorities, effort, or whether they should have done this sooner.
Joe, is that actually kindness or is it just habit by this point? Because those are not the same thing, and people blur them all the time.
Sometimes it's kindness. A lot of the time it's habit wearing kindness's jacket. People learn that bluntness is rude. Then they overcorrect until every cancellation sounds like a mini apology, even when the only thing that was needed was a straight answer.
And then everyone copies the same script because it feels normal. You start with something warm, then the regret, then the excuse, and suddenly the clean version, I'm not coming, starts sounding weirdly rude, even when it's clearer.
That's pretty close to how refusals work in a lot of everyday English. People often lead with positive feeling language, then regret, then an explanation, because a refusal threatens the other person's expectation. The script exists to lower the sting, not because the speaker has discovered a deeper truth about their soul.
Which is fine until the softening becomes the point. Then the other person has to decode whether you're actually sorry or just trying to make the conversation easier on yourself.
And that decoding job is part of the cost. If you cancel and immediately make your disappointment the headline, the canceled on person may end up reassuring you instead of dealing with the actual change in plans. Now their job is to comfort you about something you caused.
Right, and that's why it can feel rude even when the literal words are polite. The burden shifts. Ugh. The other person has to manage your guilt, and now the cancellation starts sounding like a request for emotional labor.
That's the pressure point. It isn't just that people dislike being canceled on. It's that they dislike being made responsible for your discomfort after you pulled the plug. That's where the performance stops reading as courtesy and starts reading as attacks on the other person.
And the really annoying part is that nobody thinks of themselves as doing that. They think they're being decent because they didn't just say, too bad, not happening.
Right. Most people are not sitting there trying to manipulate a friendship. They're following a habit that got rewarded 100 times. Politeness rewards cushioning. Guilt rewards cushioning. And then everybody acts like the cushion itself is the honest part.
Which is basically a very ordinary social trap. If everyone around you is soothed by the softer version, you learn that the softer version is what good people do, even if it doesn't actually help the other person plan their life.
And that's where the Michigan State result is useful. People mostly wanted advance notice and a brief text or call. They did not, by and large, want a long apology scene. And the thing that bothered them most was a lie, not the absence of dramatic regret.
That part matters a lot. If the reason is fake, the whole performance gets more insulting because now you're not just canceling, you're asking me to swallow a story you probably don't even believe.
Exactly. Honesty is doing more work there than theatrics. The closer the relationship, the more the cancellation can sting. But even then, the fix is usually straightforward. Tell me early, tell me plainly, and don't make me guess what happened.
So the incentive structure is pretty clear. Look considerate, avoid friction, keep the friendship intact, maybe dodge some shame, and use a familiar script that gets you out of the room without making a scene.
Yeah, and that's why it survives. It's not some grand plan. It's a habit loop. Say the softer thing, get less pushback, feel less guilty, repeat. The rest of us then reward the polite version because it feels easier in the moment.
Which means we probably help keep it alive more than we want to admit. If we always soothe the clumsy cancellation, we teach people that the performance is enough.
That's probably the next question. Whether we're helping keep the ritual alive every time we insist on the polite version instead of the clear one.
Okay, but here's the annoying part. Some of what people hate about canceled plans is coming from us, not just from the person bailing. We say we want honesty, then the second somebody says, I can't make it, we start waiting for the apology performance like it's part of the ticket price.
That's the uncomfortable version, and it's probably real in a lot of cases. Not every case, obviously, but there is a social script where the cancellation itself is treated like a test, and the real thing people want is reassurance that they're still liked.
Right, and I think people pretend that's about manners when sometimes it's just emotional appetite. They don't only want, sorry, can't come. They want, sorry, can't come. I feel terrible. Please don't think I'm rude. Please know I value you. Please keep liking me. Ugh, that's a lot of extra work for one dinner.
And to be fair, some of that isn't fake. If you cancel on a close friend, it can genuinely land like rejection, even if you had a legitimate reason. The trouble is when the reaction to that feeling becomes a demand for extra emotional labor, because then people learn that plain honesty is too expensive.
So the audience isn't innocent either. We reward remorse theater. We say we don't want a long speech, but if the person just says the clean version, we sometimes punish them for not sounding hurt enough.
That's the part worth separating, though. A reasonable norm is don't be cold, don't be careless, don't make the other person guess whether you value them. The unreasonable norm is you have to perform enough guilt that I feel socially repaired after hearing no.
Okay, but where do you draw the line? Because there is a difference between sounding considerate and sounding like you're managing my emotions for me.
I think the line is whether the message still sounds like a real explanation from a real person. A quick, I'm sorry, I need to cancel, I can't make it tonight, is basic courtesy. A whole extra layer of self-blame because somebody expects to be soothed is where it starts turning into emotional labor.
That matters because people act like there is one universal correct amount of regret, and there isn't. In some groups, a plain cancellation is totally fine. In others, if you don't add a little warmth, everyone starts reading into it like you're filing paperwork to leave the friendship.
And the key is that neither side gets to pretend it's only the other side's problem. If you want less guilt tripping, the culture around receiving cancellations has to stop treating directness like disrespect. But if you want less bluntness that feels harsh, the person canceling still has to do the basic courtesy work.
So maybe the real complaint is not people are too sensitive or people are too fake. It's that we all keep asking for two things at once. Be honest, and also make me feel okay about your honesty. And those requests can collide fast.
That's the collision. Honesty is supposed to lower ambiguity. But the social instinct is to turn every awkward cancellation into a referendum on the relationship. Then the canceled plan is doing way more work than it should.
And if you make that the norm, people adapt. They don't become kinder, they become better actors. They learn the correct amount of sadness to attach to bad news. And now everyone's performing the same little script because nobody wants to be the one who sounds cold.
Exactly. Which is why the audience has to be careful about what it rewards. If you say you care about honesty, don't make the honest version socially punishing just because it skipped the extra guilt speech.
And maybe the self-critique is this. A lot of us don't actually want pure honesty. We want honest words with a soft landing, which is fair up to a point, but it stops being fair when we make the soft landing mandatory and call it decency.
Yeah, and different circles tolerate different amounts of landing gear. Some friend groups are fine with blunt and quick. Others need a little more care because that's just how they work. The mistake is pretending your group's comfort level is a moral law. Okay, so if the problem is the fake apology routine, the next question is what the cleaner version sounds like in real life. Because I don't think the fix is to be colder. It's probably the opposite. Be clearer, earlier, and less theatrical about it.
That already sounds better. The thing people hate is not just the cancellation itself, it's the little guilt performance around it, the extra paragraph, the dramatic, I'm so sorry. When you can tell the person would have preferred a plain text 5 hours ago.
And that lines up with the basic advice people actually seem to like. Give advance notice, use a quick text or call, and don't invent some weird fiction to make yourself sound more noble. There's also the honesty piece. People are much more annoyed by a lie than by a brief...
So the rule is basically lead with the cancel, not the essay.
Yes. Say it plainly, say it early, and if you're actually sorry, say that once without turning it into a hostage negotiation. A real, sorry I can't make it, does the job. You do not need to prove you're suffering to earn basic courtesy.
That's the part people keep missing. Honest regret is enough when it's real. If you're not disappointed, don't fake it just because you think the other person wants the little sadness garnish. That's the stuff that feels rude after the fact, because now they're also managing your performance.
Right. And if you do want to reschedule, make it a genuine offer, not a reflex. Can we do another day? Is useful only if you actually mean another day. Otherwise, it turns into a fake open door that makes the other person wait around for a plan that already died.
Okay, but what do you do if you really do feel bad? Because some people hear, be concise, and they turn into a machine. They send one tiny text, and it sounds like they're canceling a dentist appointment, not dinner with somebody they actually like.
That's where tone and relationship matter more than a fixed script. If it's a close friend, a little more context can be normal. If it's a casual plan, less is usually better. The point is to match the amount of explanation to the relationship, not to your panic level.
So not one etiquette rule for the entire human race. Shocking. But I think that's the useful standard. Be truthful, be brief, and don't turn your guilt into their homework. If you have a real reason, give the real reason. If you have a real apology, keep it simple.
And there is a middle category people skip. Not fake therapy monologue, not ice-cold text, just enough warmth to show you care, without pretending the cancellation is a tragic event. Different circles tolerate different amounts of landing gear, but the landing still has to be real.
Right, and the tricky part is that some groups genuinely want a little more softness. Family might need more context. Close friends might want a quick call instead of a text. But that's not the same as demanding a performance. More care is fine. More guilt theater is not.
Exactly. The question isn't whether you can sound perfectly polished. It's whether the other person leaves the exchange feeling informed and respected instead of responsible for soothing you. A considerate cancellation lowers friction for them, not just discomfort for you.
And that's where fake disappointment gets rude fast. If you're obviously thrilled to stay home, but you talk like you've been personally wounded by the universe, the other person has to do extra social math. They have to decide whether you're sincere, weirdly formal, or just trying to make them say, no, it's okay.
Totally. The honest version is usually smaller. I can't make it, sorry, something came up. If you mean it, add a real apology or a real reschedule. If you don't, stop there. That is cleaner than inflating the moment just to make yourself feel less guilty.
And that seems like the decent finish line. Tell the truth early, don't lie, don't spray guilt, and don't offer a fake rain check just to look considerate. If there is warmth, make it real. If there isn't, don't counterfeit it and call it manners. Okay, I think we've landed on the part that actually matters. Saying, I'm disappointed is not automatically rude. It only gets gross when it starts doing extra work for you, like making the other person absorb your social discomfort on top of the cancellation.
That's the clean version. The phrase itself is fine if it's just honest regret. But once it becomes pressure, once it implies you should feel worse now, it stops being a courtesy and starts being a tactic.
So the line is basically, be disappointed if you're actually disappointed, but don't turn that disappointment into a tiny moral invoice. Is that fair, or am I making it too neat?
No, that's fair. The useful distinction is between feeling let down and trying to make the other person manage your feeling for you, because those are not the same social move at all.
And that's why people get weird about it. They're not reacting to the sadness part. They're reacting to the performance part. You can hear when somebody means, "Aw, that's a bummer," versus, "I need you to notice how much you've inconvenienced my beautiful plans."
Right. And the annoying thing is that the second version often gets defended as being more polite. But if the politeness creates guilt, it's not really politeness. It's just a nicer looking way to make the cancellation cost land on somebody else.
That's the part people can feel even when they can't name it. The message becomes, I'm allowed to cancel, but now you're responsible for soothing me about it. And that's where it starts to feel like the room got handed a bill nobody agreed to pay.
I'd keep one nuance in there, though. Sometimes you really are disappointed. And sometimes the relationship matters enough that a little extra warmth is normal. If you and a friend had real plans and one of you bails a lot, some emotional honesty is appropriate. Would you say that changes if it's a close friend versus, say, somebody you barely know?
Yeah, absolutely. If it's a close friend, you can afford a little more human messiness because the relationship can carry it. If it's basically a casual invite or somebody you don't know that well, the big emotional regret can start to feel like you're asking them to participate in your feelings when all they needed was a clean answer.
That's the good boundary. The phrase should fit the relationship and the pattern. One sincere sentence is different from a speech designed to make the other person volunteer guilt, and most people can tell the difference pretty quickly.
So the usable rule is probably say what happened, say you can't make it, and if you're disappointed, keep it proportional. Don't make the other person perform a recovery just because you needed to protect your own ego.
Exactly. You can be bummed without turning the cancellation into a referendum on how much you were looking forward to it. That's where people hear the pressure, because now they're not just receiving information, they're being handed emotional homework.
And honestly, honesty is usually kinder anyway. A flat, calm, sorry, I can't make it, lets the other person adjust fast. The fake remorse just drags out the exchange and makes both people do little emotional bookkeeping they didn't ask for.
That's the piece I'd keep. Be brief, be real, and don't add a guilt garnish. If the relationship can handle more warmth, fine. If not, don't force it. The goal is for the cancellation to be a plain cancellation, not a social punishment with nicer wording.
So that's the landing. Genuine disappointment is allowed. Performative disappointment is the problem. And the best version is direct enough that nobody has to decode it. Most people don't mind a canceled plan. They mind feeling like they're supposed to apologize for accepting reality.
So, that's the end of this one. We appreciate you listening to Say the Question. Follow Say the Question, and we'll be back with another episode tomorrow.